The following stories have been intended for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. My grandfather grew up on a chicken farm outside of a small town in Poland, which you probably have never heard of. He passed away a few years ago at the age of 82. A few days before his passing, due to an aggressive form of stomach cancer, he had sat me down next to him in his old rocking chair, and he said in his Polish accent, "After I took the boat to New York, I promised to leave this story behind." He didn't look up as he spoke to me, simply staring into his cup of black coffee. He says, "It's been 70 years, and I must tell someone before I meet God." I was born in a small, quaint, empty town, which, despite the Nazi occupation, it still functioned. We lived in this 2-bedroom farmhouse. My father, my mother, and my brothers, Igor and Michael. I'm sorry that you never got to meet any of them. But anyway, Michael and Igor were twins. They were identical twins, actually. And we had heard rumors of the Nazi fascination with identical twins. This forced us to be even more reserved, even though we already lived in a secluded part of the countryside, in the last occupied house in the town. In order to avoid going into the occupied towns, we basically ate only chicken and eggs for every meal, and whatever else Mama could gather from the garden. It was lonely, but we survived. The thing that was most difficult for me was the fact that I had to sleep in the basement. Due to Michael and Igor being toddlers, they required my father's and my mother's attention. The basement was cold, with only a small window, and the moonlight was the only light that I got. Because of this, I always delayed going down there until I was absolutely exhausted and ready to go to sleep. That way, I wouldn't have to lie there, awake. On the nights that I couldn't manage to sleep, I would look outside of the window, which gave me a small view of the garden and the large abandoned water well. This was my daily activity throughout those lonely, war-torn nights. In general, it was boring and uneventful, but occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of a family, or even just a man. Sometimes 2 lovers, sneaking their way through our garden up to our front door. They always looked very rushed and frightened, and sometimes they had uniforms on. What would follow were horrible sounds of banging and pleadings for whoever lived there to open the door, followed up by an argument between my mother and my father over whether we should let them in. My grandfather moved in his rocking chair to adjust himself, and he continued, "You see, son, we didn't know it, well, at least I didn't, that we lived fairly close to the Auschwitz concentration camp, and that those people, they were escapees." I asked, "Well, did your father let those people inside the house?" He said, "No. It would have been a death sentence for them as well as for us. The Nazis didn't like the Polish people, but they tolerated us. And it was easier to hide Michael or Igor than an entire family. My father did what he had to do in order to keep his family safe. As the war went on, fewer and fewer people began to show up in the middle of the night. That's about the time our chicken and vegetables began to disappear. Losing our only supply of food would not have been tolerable, and at that point, my father suspected it was the escapees, so he built a fence around the property. Despite this, the chickens still continued to disappear. They weren't killed, they were simply just missing. They vanished from their cages and their pens. One night, I decided to stay up myself in order to see if I could find out what the answer was. I battled my tiredness until the wee hours of the morning, and despite the poor lighting and the rain, I caught a glimpse of what seemed to be a human figure run across the garden. I quickly rushed upstairs to tell my father, and he ran outside, armed with a knife, the best home defense weapon we could afford. But we found nothing. No one. There wasn't a soul outside. The next day we did find something though. Footprints, leading from the chicken cages to the water well. They were made in the wet mud from the rain, but they were bare feet. No shoes, no socks, just feet. My father had mercy on the man who was trying to find refuge and left him a note, indicating that he had 2 days to leave, and then he would begin to seal the well. I waited impatiently for my grandfather to tell me about the fate of this man. My grandfather continued. The following night, I got the idea to take a blanket down the well to the man since the winter was creeping in. I waited until my parents were asleep, so I snuck outside of the house. I gradually walked over to the well, and I shouted something friendly down the well, indicating to the poor man that my intentions were benign, and I began my descent down the well, clinging hand and foot to the pegs attached to the stones. As I neared the bottom of the well, I smelled something. It was absolutely horrific, and I pulled out my father's flashlight from my pocket to try to shine the light on the man. It was then when I came to the realization of how large this well actually was. Having been used to supply water for the entire town and its families in the past, families which no longer remained, but I found no man, only a hole. It was a gap in the stone, where the wall of the well had collapsed, opening up to some type of crevice, only about 2 meters or 6 feet wide, and about 3 meters or 9 feet deep and tall. Inside sat not a man, but an entire family, of which only a single skeleton-like creature survived. The light reflected off its sunken eyes and gray skin. Blood was on its face, and chicken carcasses were strewn everywhere. A pile of decomposing poultry beside a woman, and what I suspected had been her son and daughter, children who couldn't have been much more than 5 years old, appeared that they have been dead for weeks. The man, if he even could be called that, just gazed at the light. I stared back, incapable of breaking his stare. The eye contact was very intense, yet I did not feel threatened by him, for he lacked any aggression whatsoever. He simply crouched, motionlessly, without a sound, next to the putrefying bodies of his loved ones and the chickens that must have been his source of water as their meat was uneaten. He was empty, devoid of whatever in us makes us human. He should have realized the members of his family had died a long time ago, but he was still bringing food for their corpses. He just couldn't accept it. He did finally turn his head, though, towards the bodies of his family, when I had shined the light back onto the corpse of his daughter. The man down there just stared at her. Then he sat down closer to his daughter. I spoke up to him and I said, "You can leave now. I'll open the gate so you can escape. My father is going to seal the well in the morning. It would be best for you to leave now." But my young voice and advice seemed to have no effect on him. At that moment, I decided it would be better for me to just climb back up and leave, and hope the man would follow my advice and escape. As I began my climb upwards out of the well, I shined the light on the man one last time. I asked my grandpa when he said this, What did you see? My grandpa said, I saw a tear fall from his eye. He had become a man once again. He was only able to break free from the delusion after seeing the body of his daughter, which had until that time been obscured by the darkness of the well. He realized then that he had been bringing food not to his family, but to corpses. That same night, it rained again. But in the morning, when my father returned to seal the well, I found no footprints leading from the well.